October 7th, 1949. Los Angeles, California. 26-year-old actress Jean Spangler leaves her home and tells her sister-in-law that she is planning to visit her ex-husband and spend the night working on a film shoot, but she never returns. 2 days later, Jean's purse is discovered in Griffith Park, containing a cryptic note addressed to someone named Kirk. Since Jean had recently worked on a film starring Kirk Douglas, there is speculation that the note might be addressed to him, but he denies any knowledge of what happened. The case would contain numerous theories, including rumors of a botched abortion, alleged ties to organized crime, and speculation that Jean's disappearance was connected to the Black Dahlia murder, but no trace of her is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got ourselves a pretty famous Hollywood mystery to cover today, the 1949 disappearance of Jean Spangler. Needless to say, this is a case I've been wanting to do an episode about since the inception of this podcast. Jean Spangler was an aspiring actress who was attempting to launch a movie career, and while she had managed to obtain some uncredited bit parts in Hollywood productions, stardom still eluded her. Jean was also a single mother, and one night, she asked her sister-in-law to look after her daughter while she spent the evening working on a film shoot, but Jean subsequently vanished without a trace, and it turned out there were no movies being filmed in Los Angeles that night. Days later, Jean's purse was found, and it contained a handwritten note addressed to a man named Kirk, and this is the main reason I am finally deciding to cover this case now. As you probably heard, legendary actor Kirk Douglas passed away last month at the age of 103, and Jean had worked as a background extra in a film starring Douglas shortly before she went missing. It's long been suspected that Douglas may have been the Kirk mentioned in the note, and that even if he had no direct involvement in Jean's disappearance, he may have still known more than he let on. However, this is a very convoluted case containing a number of alternate theories which don't involve Kirk Douglas, so we're going to explore them all on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the mysterious disappearance of Jean Spangler. Our story begins in Los Angeles in 1949. Our central figure is 26-year-old Jean Spangler, who is hoping to launch a successful career as a Hollywood actress. Jean currently lives in the Wilshire district at the Park La Brea residential complex and shares a 2-bedroom apartment with her mother, Florence Spangler, and 5-year-old daughter, Christine. 7 years earlier, Jean had gotten married to a plastics manufacturer named Dexter Benner, but within 6 months, she would file for divorce, accusing her husband of cruelty. In spite of this, they would continue to maintain an on-again, off-again relationship for the next few years, and even have their daughter, Christine, before Dexter enlisted in the Army and went overseas to serve during World War II. The couple's divorce would officially go through in 1946, and after a lengthy 2-year court battle, Jean was awarded custody of Christine. Jean had previously worked as a model and a dancer, but now wanted to become an actress, and her mother Florence would help her raise Christine while she pursued her dream. After joining the Screen Extras Guild, Jean was able to obtain work as a bit player, dancer, or background extra in 8 Hollywood productions, but she did not receive screen credit for any of these small roles. On Friday, October the 7th, Florence was away visiting family in Kentucky, so Jean's sister-in-law, Sophie, was visiting from St. Louis and staying at their apartment. Jean had lost her brother Edward during World War II when his bomber went missing on a mission near Japan, leaving Sophie a widow, but she still remained close with the Spangler family. Jean asked Sophie if she would watch over Christine because she was going to meet up with her ex-husband to discuss an overdue child support payment. Afterward, Jean would spend the remainder of the evening working on a film shoot. At around 5 p.m., Jean said goodbye to Christine and Sophie and gave her sister-in-law a mischievous wink and said, "Wish me luck," before she left the apartment. 2.5 hours later, Jean phoned Sophie in order to check on Christine, and also implied that she would probably not return home that evening because she would, quote-unquote, have to work the full 8 hours. The call soon ended, but this would turn out to be the last time that Jean was confirmed to be alive. Over 24 hours passed, and Jean did not return to the apartment, so Sophie became concerned and decided to visit the Wilshire Division of the Los Angeles Police Department to officially report Jean missing. At first, the police did not seem overly concerned, figuring that Jean had just gone off on some fling and would resurface, but their tune would soon change after a surprising discovery. On the morning of October 9th, Jean's purse would be found near the entrance to the Ferndale Trail at Griffith Park, located just over 5 miles away from Jean's apartment. Jean's identification and other personal effects were still inside the purse, but one of the straps was torn loose, suggesting that someone had ripped it away by force. But the strangest clue was a cryptic handwritten note which read, quote, "Kirk, can't wait any longer. Going to see Dr. Scott. It will work best this way while Mother is away." End quote. When Florence Spangler returned from Kentucky, she recognized the note as being in Jean's handwriting, and after it was analyzed by an expert and compared with other samples of Jean's writing, he came to the same conclusion. It was suspected that the purse was left near the entrance a short time before it was discovered, possibly after being thrown from a passing vehicle. It seemed likely that if the purse had been there during the daytime on October the 8th, it would have been seen by hikers. An extensive search was performed of the 4,200-acre Griffith Park, but it turned up no trace of Jean or any other evidence connected to her disappearance. Since Jean had told Sophie she was planning to meet with her ex-husband, Dexter Benner, about a child support payment, he was questioned by police. But Dexter denied seeing Jean that night and claimed that no meeting had ever been scheduled. Dexter's story was backed up by his current wife, Lynn, who said she was home with him the entire evening and that Jean never showed up. The disappearance became even stranger when investigators checked with all the studios and the Screen Extras Guild to try and figure out which film production Jean had been planning to work on, but they learned that no shoots had been scheduled at all on the evening of October the 7th. Once Jean's disappearance made the news, there would be numerous reported sightings of her on the night she went missing. An employee at the farmer's market, located only a few blocks away from Jean's apartment, claimed that they remembered seeing Jean inside the store at around 6 p.m., where she browsed around for a long period of time and appeared to be waiting for someone. At around 2 a.m. on the morning of October the 8th, the owner of the Cheese Box restaurant on the Sunset Strip said they saw Jean inside the establishment with an unidentified man who appeared to be in his 30s, and they were arguing with each other at their table. A local radio personality named Al the Sheik Lazar did live broadcasts of his shows inside the restaurant, and he would also recall having seen Jean there during that time period, though curiously, he reported seeing her arguing with 2 men. When the Sheik approached their table with a microphone to interview them, one of the men signaled that they wanted him to go away. Later that morning, A gas station attendant reported that a man driving a blue-gray convertible pulled in and asked him to fill up the tank because he was going to Fresno. The attendant was certain he saw Jean slumped down in the front seat, but as the convertible was pulling away, she turned and yelled out, "Have the police follow this car." While the attendant did call the police, they were unable to find the convertible. So much of the focus turned to the cryptic note, and while none of Jean's family or friends seemed to know of anyone in her life named Kirk or Dr. Scott, Florence would recall two separate incidents where Jean told her that someone named Kirk was going to pick her up at the apartment. On both occasions, this Kirk remained in the car when he showed up and never went to the front door, so Florence never actually saw him. Investigators looked into all of the known Dr. Scotts located in the Los Angeles area, but none of them seemed to have any connection to Jean. Her sister-in-law Sophie would claim that she once recalled seeing the name Dr. Scott inside an address book at Jean's apartment, but Sophie could not find the book anywhere after Jean went missing. However, Jean's former divorce attorney would claim that years earlier, she once carried on an affair with a man named Scotty while Dexter was serving overseas during the war. The attorney claimed Jean told him that Scotty was abusive and violent and had threatened to kill her if she ended the relationship. The affair did come to an end when Dexter returned home, and as far as the attorney knew, Jean had not seen Scotty since 1945. The only other information available about Scotty was that he had been an Air Corps lieutenant, but police were never able to locate or question him. But the Kirk connection became a lot more interesting once it was discovered that Jean had recently had a bit part as a hula dancer in a film called Young Man with a Horn, which happened to star one of the biggest names in Hollywood, Kirk Douglas. And oddly, Douglas wound up inserting himself into the investigation before the police even made the connection. At the time, Douglas was vacationing in Palm Springs, but after learning about Jean's disappearance and the discovery of the note in her purse, Douglas took it upon himself to call LAPD Deputy Chief Tad Brown and confirm that he did not know Jean and was most definitely not the mysterious Kirk. Douglas would soon be interviewed by Deputy Chief Brown, but this time, he claimed that a friend had reminded him that Jean was a tall girl with a green dress who worked on Young Man with a Horn, and Douglas now recalled having briefly talked and kidded with her on the set during filming. But Douglas maintained that he never learned her name and had no other interactions with her outside the production, and even went so far as to hold a formal press conference to deny any knowledge of Jean's disappearance. Well, the case would take yet another interesting turn when one of Jean's friends told police that she was 3 months pregnant at the time she went missing and had been planning to get an abortion. Since abortions were still illegal in 1949, there was speculation that perhaps this was the reason for Jean going to see the mysterious Dr. Scott. Some of Jean's acquaintances would make reference to a former medical student who went by the nickname Doc and reportedly hung out at the same bars and nightclubs on the Sunset Strip, which Jean often liked to frequent. There were always rumors that this Doc would perform abortions for money, but investigators were unable to figure out his true identity or even confirm he existed. Police also spoke to actor Robert Cummings, who was friends with Jean and had recently worked with her on a film called The Petty Girl. Once again, Jean had a small bit part in the movie, and shortly before she went missing, Cummings recalled a conversation he had with her on set, where she mentioned a casual affair she was having. While Jean never mentioned the name of the man she was involved with, and said the relationship wasn't serious, she told Cummings that she was having the time of her life. But another surprising rumor that police would investigate was that Jean's disappearance was the result of her becoming involved with some notorious gangsters. Prior to her acting career, Jean had worked as a showgirl at a nightclub called Florentine Gardens, which was known for being a popular hangout for gangsters, including the infamous Mickey Cohen, the biggest organized crime kingpin operating in Los Angeles during that time period. In the week prior to her disappearance, Jean had reportedly been seen in Palm Springs with David Ogle, who was nicknamed Little Davy and happened to be one of Mickey Cohen's top henchmen. Well, believe it or not, only 2 days after Jean disappeared, Ogle would also become a missing person. At the time, Ogle was under indictment for conspiracy and had been released on $25,000 bail, but on October the 9th, after last being seen leaving a haberdashery owned by Cohen, Ogle vanished without a trace, and his abandoned Cadillac would later be found near the campus of UCLA. Interestingly enough, the exact same thing had happened 1 month earlier to Frank Niccoli, another gangster who had worked as a bodyguard for Cohen. Like Ogle, Niccoli was under indictment for conspiracy and had been released on a $50,000 bail, but after leaving the exact same haberdashery on September the 2nd, Niccoli also disappeared. His abandoned car was left behind at Los Angeles International Airport, and the vehicle's keys were found inside a sewer. The LAPD would hear rumors circulate that Ogle and Niccoli had been murdered, and their bodies were dumped into a lime pit at a vineyard in Cucamonga, but in February of 1950, they were also contacted by customs agents who informed them that there had been sightings of the 2 missing gangsters and Jean Spangler in El Paso, Texas. In fact, a clerk at a local hotel would identify Jean from her photograph and claim she had been there. Of course, this led to speculation that Ogle and Niccoli had gone on the run to avoid prosecution, and that Jean had somehow gotten mixed up with either or both of them and disappeared voluntarily. Well, Jean's family denied that she had any associations with gangsters and completely rejected the idea that she ran off on her own, as they believed she never would have abandoned her daughter, Christine. Police would investigate a number of reported sightings of Jean throughout the United States and Mexico, but none of these leads panned out. Following Jean's disappearance, her ex-husband, Dexter Benner, was awarded temporary custody of Christine, spawning a lengthy legal battle which would last over 3 years. During his original custody battle with Jean, Dexter had launched a smear campaign against her, alleging that Jean was an unfit mother who, quote-unquote, preferred parties to priorities. Before Jean was officially awarded custody of Christine, Dexter had prevented his ex-wife from seeing their daughter on no less than 23 separate occasions. Now that Jean was gone, Dexter wanted his current wife, Lynn, to legally adopt Christine on the grounds of abandonment, but his attempts were blocked by the courts since it could not be officially confirmed if Jean was alive or dead. It wasn't long before Dexter found himself in an equally heated custody battle with Jean's mother, Florence, and things reached the point where Dexter repeatedly denied a court order which allowed Florence to have visitation with Christine. By 1953, Dexter would be ordered to serve 15 days in jail for contempt of court, but rather than turn himself in, he fled to Florida with his wife and daughter, and police could not find them. From what I can tell, Christine never had any further contact with her mother's side of the family, and Florence would pass away in 1991. For the rest of his life, Dexter remained married to Lynn before he passed away in 2007. Lynn herself died just this past August, though I'm not sure of the current whereabouts of Christine. As far as Jean Spangler goes, her disappearance has remained in the spotlight for the past 70 years, but in spite of the amount of time that has passed, the LAPD still considers this to be an active case. But in spite of countless leads and a number of different theories, there are still no conclusive answers about what actually happened to her. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Okay, so I mentioned in the intro that I've been wanting to do an episode about this case for quite some time, but the main reason I finally decided to do it now was because of the recent passing of Kirk Douglas. And quite frankly, before this happened, I was very anxious to see what the public reaction would be to a very disturbing rumor surrounding Douglas, which we have to address here. For years, there have been rumors out there that the legendary Natalie Wood, who started out her career in Hollywood as a child actress, was raped by a powerful Hollywood actor in the mid-1950s when she was only 16 years old. According to Natalie's sister, Lana Wood, Their family drove Natalie to a hotel for an audition with this actor, but while they waited in the car, this man raped Natalie for hours in an attack which was so brutal that she was left physically injured. Lana believed that their mother, who had pushed Natalie into acting since childhood, convinced her to remain silent about the incident because speaking out against such a big Hollywood name would have meant the end of her career. While it has never been officially confirmed, the rumor which has circulated for a very long time is that the rapist was Kirk Douglas. And this was always one of the biggest reasons I held off doing an episode about the Jean Spangler case. Given that Douglas was connected to the unsolved disappearance of another young actress, which took place only 5 years before this alleged incident with Natalie Wood, I knew I should not do the episode without addressing these rape allegations, but I wasn't sure how well known this rumor was. I wanted to see if any more information about this story would come out after Douglas passed away, and at the very least, I wanted to gauge public reaction. Well, at the time of this recording, we are only 3 weeks removed from Douglas's death, and nobody has publicly named him as the rapist, and given how much time has passed, I don't think we'll ever be able to conclusively prove or disprove if the story is true. But when I logged onto Twitter on the day Douglas died, and I saw that Natalie Wood's name was trending higher than Kirk Douglas's, that confirmed to me just how widespread the rumor had become. It's no big secret that many young, aspiring actresses have been used and abused by powerful men ever since the inception of Hollywood, and obviously, an incident like this would have been a lot easier to cover up in the pre-social media world of the 1950s. But the main reason I needed to bring this whole subject up is because you have to ask, if Kirk Douglas was capable of raping a 16-year-old, would he also have been capable of causing Jean Spangler's disappearance? Well, even without the rape allegations, Douglas was clearly not a saint, as he openly admitted to being a womanizer who conducted numerous extramarital affairs on both of his wives. In 1949, Douglas was still married to his first wife, Diana Dill, and already had 2 sons with her, though they would divorce within 2 years. And 1949 was also the same year when Douglas's stock as a Hollywood star was really starting to skyrocket, as his acclaimed performance in the movie Champion would earn him his first Academy Award nomination. So theoretically, if Douglas had been conducting a secret affair with Jean Spangler, and she became pregnant with his illegitimate child, he would definitely have had every reason in the world to cover the whole thing up. However, before we start pointing the finger at Kirk Douglas, we have to remember that there are a ton of alternate theories in this case, so we'll get back to him in a little while. But first, we have to discuss a part of this story which doesn't get mentioned too often. Believe it or not, the one and only Robert Stack has a small connection to this case. Yes, that's right. 4 decades before he became the host of Unsolved Mysteries, Mr. Stack himself became embroiled in an unsolved mystery. But don't worry, he wasn't a suspect or anything. Stack had actually become friends with Jean Spangler during her time in Hollywood, and on the evening before she went missing, he happened to be walking down the street past her apartment and thought he saw a shadowy figure lurking outside one of the windows, as if they were trying to get in. It was so dark that Stack could not even tell if the figure was a man or woman, but since he was feeling tired and just wanted to get home, he pretty much just shrugged the whole thing off. But once he learned of Jean's disappearance a few days later, Stack came forward and reported what he saw to the police. Of course, we have no idea who that shadowy figure was, or if the incident had any significance to the case at all, but for obvious reasons, it was worth mentioning, and I'm kind of surprised that this story was never featured on Unsolved Mysteries. If nothing else, it would have been pretty surreal to see Robert Stack playing himself if they filmed a reenactment of this scene. I've never seen Stack publicly comment on this case, but I've always wondered if he regretted not reporting the incident sooner, and if this memory played a role in his decision to host a show about unsolved cold cases. Now, I will say that the main source for this story is a blog called KJ Wood's Paranormal Encounters, so as you can imagine, I was a bit skeptical when I first heard it, but Kyle J. Wood is a crime historian who has conducted extensive research on Jean's disappearance, and he was actually interviewed when this case was featured on a 2001 episode of the TV series Mysteries and Scandals. Wood also posted a photograph of himself with Robert Stack on his blog, and he has conducted interviews with Jean's sister-in-law Sophie, of which there are snippets available on YouTube. So I am pretty certain that he's a reliable source. Anyway, Sophie passed away in 2007, but during his interviews with her, Wood was able to obtain some exclusive information which had never been released publicly, but pointed suspicion towards Jean's ex-husband, Dexter Benner. When the aforementioned Mysteries and Scandals episode was produced, Dexter was contacted by the show about a possible interview, but he declined, and also said that his daughter Christine would not be interested either. Sophie also declined to be interviewed on the show, but apparently, the main reason for that is because she still feared potential repercussions from Dexter. As you recall, when she left the apartment on the night she went missing, Jean told Sophie that she was planning to see Dexter to discuss a child support payment before she went to work on a film shoot. Well, we definitely know that the second part of that story was a lie, and both Dexter and his wife would maintain that Jean never met them and they were at home the entire night. Well, here's the incriminating part about Dexter, which Sophie revealed in her interview. She said that Dexter showed up at their apartment on the morning of October the 8th to pick up Christine for weekend visitation, but he never came to the front door, and Christine just ran out to meet him on the sidewalk. According to Sophie, when the police later questioned Dexter, they noticed he had some scratches on his face, which he claimed were the result of dropping a case of glass bottles at work, but they didn't really buy that story. In retrospect, Sophie wished she had gone up and spoke to Dexter on the morning of the 8th to see if he had fresh scratches on his face. The police were suspicious enough about Dexter that they excavated the garage in his house, but they never found any incriminating evidence to suggest that he was involved in Jean's disappearance. But it sounds like Jean's mother, Florence, went to her grave believing that Dexter was responsible for what happened. I mean, Dexter certainly did not sound like the nicest man in the world, and his marriage to Jean was a pretty tumultuous one. For her part, it doesn't sound like Jean was a saint during the marriage either, and she led a pretty wild partying lifestyle in which she conducted affairs behind Dexter's back. But to her credit, it seems like the birth of Christine was a major turning point in Jean's life, and by all accounts, she was a very good mother. Of course, since Jean wound up being awarded custody of Christine after a lengthy court battle, this could have given Dexter a potential motive to kill her. It's crazy to look through the archives of newspapers.com and see that the Los Angeles Times actually published articles about Jean and Dexter's custody battle in 1948, even though Jean was not a famous person at that time. I guess this was done because the idea of an aspiring actress who was referred to in these articles as a quote-unquote glamour girl attempting to further her career while raising a child as a single mother was considered a lot more scandalous back then. Of course, the eventual custody battle between Dexter and Florence would also get a lot of coverage in the press, though that's a bit more understandable since Jean's disappearance had become a major story by that point. I guess the plausibility of Dexter's involvement in the crime would depend on whether you believe his current wife, Lynn, would have been willing to lie to police and provide an alibi for him on the night Jean went missing. Before she married Dexter, Lynn had already gone through a divorce of her own, and believe it or not, I've read that her ex-husband, Eli Lasky, was an associate of Mickey Cohen, who also figures into this story, though there isn't much information out there at all about Eli Lasky. But here's what we know about the timeline after Jean left her apartment. She was seen at the farmer's market by an employee at around 6 p.m. who said Jean appeared to be waiting for someone. Of course, eyewitness sightings can be unreliable, but this employee said she had seen Jean in the market on previous occasions, which is why she recognized her. And the last time Jean was confirmed to be alive is when she phoned Sophie at 7:30. By all accounts, this was a very common practice for Jean, because whenever she went out, regardless of what she was doing, she always made time to phone home and check on her daughter. Of course, Jean told Sophie that she would, quote-unquote, have to work the full 8 hours, but since we now know that Jean was not actually working on a film shoot, this implies she had something secret planned which she did not want her family to know about. But the part which confuses me is that if Jean was lying about the film shoot, why also lie about going to see Dexter? If she really was planning to see Dexter, and he was the one who ultimately killed her, then what was Jean doing during that 2.5-hour window between when she left the apartment and made the phone call? There were also a couple more eyewitness sightings of Jean, but before we discuss them, we have to address one of the more controversial elements of this case, and that's the theory that Jean became a victim of the Black Dahlia killer. As you probably know, that infamous crime took place in Los Angeles less than 3 years earlier, and since both Jean Spangler and Elizabeth Short were attractive, aspiring actresses in their 20s who had some physical similarities to each other, it's tempting to speculate that the two cases might be connected. But of course, the big issue is that Elizabeth Short's mutilated body was left out in the open in a public neighborhood as a spectacle, whereas Jean Spangler's body has still never been found. And perhaps not surprisingly, the biggest advocate for the theory that Jean was a Black Dahlia victim is the infamous Steve Hodel. You may have heard my previous podcast episode about the unsolved disappearance of 48-year-old Mimi Boomhauer, aka the Merry Widow, who mysteriously vanished from her Los Angeles home in August of 1949, less than 3 months before Jean went missing. Even though Mimi was over 20 years older, there has been speculation that these two cases might be connected as well. As an aside, a 49-year-old gangster named Thomas Ellery Evans was questioned by police about his possible involvement in Mimi's disappearance, though no evidence was ever found to implicate him. When Jean disappeared, police would bring in Evans for questioning again about her case, though his response was, quote, "Despite my age, police evidently think I'm a Casanova. What would a good-looking actress like Miss Spangler be doing with me?" End quote. Now, if you listen to the Boomhauer episode, I talked quite a bit about Steve Hodel, but long story short, he is a former Los Angeles homicide detective who believes that his abusive deceased father, George Hodel, was the Black Dahlia killer, and Steve has published a series of books about the subject, but his credibility took a major hit when he also accused his father of being the Zodiac killer, even though those particular murders took place 2 decades later. Steve has accused George of a lot of crimes, and not surprisingly, seems to think he was responsible for practically every unsolved crime which took place in Los Angeles during the late 1940s, including the disappearances of Mimi Boomhauer and Jean Spangler. In his books, Steve is convinced that his father was the unidentified man allegedly seen with Jean at the Cheesebox restaurant and the gas station during the early morning hours of October the 8th. He believes that they had been having an affair, and that Jean's remains might be buried on some property behind George's former house, which happened to be located only about a half-mile away from the Griffith Park entrance where Jean's purse was found. Now, I don't think it's ever been conclusively proven that George Hodel and Jean Spangler ever knew each other, but I do admit that I find the timing rather interesting. On October the 6th, the day before Jean went missing, George was arrested and charged with 1 count of incest and 1 count of sexual perversion after his 14-year-old daughter, Tamar, accused her of raping him. George wound up making bail, but Steve has theorized that he murdered Jean the following evening because she knew something about the abuse of his daughter and threatened to expose him. If George and Jean were the couple seen in the convertible at the gas station, then this would explain why she was so terrified when they drove away. Now, the weird thing about the sightings at the Cheesebox restaurant is that one witness claimed they saw Jean arguing with a man at her table, but the other witness said she was arguing with 2 different men. So if one of the men was George Hodel, who could the second man have been? Well, Steve believes that he was Fred Sexton, a longtime friend of George's, who was also his occasional partner in crime. It's worth noting that George went on trial for his daughter's rape in December of that year, but the defense did such an effective job at smarring Tamar's character that he wound up getting acquitted. Like I just said, it is interesting that George's arrest occurred such a short time before Jean went missing, but once again, there's just no conclusive evidence that they ever crossed paths, and the problem with Steve Hodell's theory is that he seems to have taken the eyewitness sightings of the two of them in public together as gospel. I certainly don't have to remind you that eyewitnesses in missing persons cases can be mistaken all the time, so how can anyone be so certain that the woman these witnesses saw was actually Jean? If Steve did not already have so many credibility issues, I might be willing to give more credence to this theory, but I think there's a reason why the alleged George Hodell connection rarely gets mentioned in most of the accounts of this case. I just think that when compared to most of the other theories, this one is pretty weak. So now we're going to talk about the theory that Jean's disappearance was the result of her alleged ties to organized crime figures, including Mickey Cohen, David Ogle, and Frank Nicoli. On the surface, this theory might seem as overly sensationalized as the connection to the Black Dahlia case, as Jean's family always denied that she associated with any gangsters. But even if she was not intimately acquainted with any of them, Jean used to work as a showgirl at a prominent nightclub, which was frequented by gangsters, so she easily could have crossed paths with some of them. The thing about Jean is that she was a very social person who loved to hang out and mingle at popular night spots, and as an aspiring actress, I'm sure she was hoping that she would eventually cross paths with the right person who would discover her and turn her into a star. There's no way Jean's family could have known about everyone in her social circle, but the one thing they said which I do agree with is that it's very unlikely she would have disappeared voluntarily and abandoned her daughter. Even though Jean may have once been a wild party girl, she fought very diligently in court to obtain custody of Christine, and really seemed serious about being a good mother, so I do find it unlikely that she would have ran off. Indeed, much like the theory about Jean being involved in an affair with George Hodell, there really isn't any concrete evidence that Jean intimately knew any gangsters, other than the alleged sightings of her with David Ogle in Palm Springs and the days prior to her disappearance. I think one of the main reasons this theory picked up so much steam is because Ogle happened to go missing just 2 days after Jean did, and if you go to newspapers.com and look at some of the editions of the Los Angeles Times from this time period, you'll see separate articles about the respective disappearances running side by side even before people started making connections between the two cases. Technically, David Ogle and Frank Nicoli are still missing persons to this day, though many years later, a notorious mobster named Jimmy the Weasel Fratiano would confess to Nicoli's murder, claiming that he strangled him to death and dumped his body in a lime pit. Indeed, even though there would be sightings of both these men and Jean in El Paso a couple months later, I find it a lot more plausible that Ogle and Nicoli were murdered on the same day they disappeared. It's actually been theorized that the El Paso sightings were false information which was intentionally spread by Mickey Cohen's rivals. You see, Cohen had paid a total of $75,000 to bail both these guys out of jail, and he would only get his money back if there was conclusive proof they were dead. But once rumors started circulating that they were still alive somewhere, Cohen wound up forfeiting his money, which caused him serious financial problems, and it was less than 2 years later when he wound up going to prison for tax evasion. So if the sightings of Ogle and Nicoli in El Paso were false, then there's no reason to put much credence into the sightings of Jean. However, if Jean was involved with either or both of these guys, then you can't discount the possibility that she was murdered as well. Like I mentioned earlier, there was never any conclusive evidence that Jean had ties to organized crime, but in 2009, author Megan Abbott published a novel titled The Song Is You, a fictionalized story based on Jean Spangler's disappearance. Now, the book is a work of fiction, so I wouldn't take anything in it as fact, but it explored the angle that Jean was a quote-unquote badger girl who was involved in a racket where she slept with prominent men and gangsters blackmailed them. This idea does have some basis in reality because shortly before she went missing, Jean told some of her friends that she was expecting to come into a great deal of money sometime in the near future. Since there's no indication that Jean was about to secure any movie roles which would lead to a substantial payday, it's been speculated that Jean may have become involved in a blackmail or extortion scheme which went horribly wrong. If true, this would certainly explain why Jean would have felt compelled to lie to her sister-in-law about working on a film shoot on the night she vanished. And this is why the key to this case might be figuring out the meaning of the cryptic note found inside her abandoned purse. Now, since one of the purse's straps was broken, this suggests that a struggle took place and someone attempted to rip the purse off Jean's shoulder. But I have a feeling this incident did not actually take place in Griffith Park. The entrance to the Ferndale Trail was often populated by people for hiking, but the purse was not discovered until the morning of October the 9th, around 36 hours after Jean was last seen. If it had been there since the evening of October the 7th, then I think it would have been found at some point on the 8th. The most logical explanation is that someone dumped or planted the purse there, and may have even tossed it from a moving vehicle while they were driving past the Ferndale entrance. But the obvious question is, if the answers behind Jean's disappearance lie with that incriminating note, then why would the person who disposed of the purse have left it in there? I know that one theory is that the note could have been intentionally misleading in order to throw the investigation off the track, and perhaps Kirk and Dr. Scott do not even exist. However, both Jean's mother and a handwriting expert were convinced that the note was in Jean's handwriting, so unless someone forced her to write it against her will, I don't see why it wouldn't be genuine. What's odd is that many of the sources about this case state there appeared to be a comma at the end of the last sentence, implying that the note may have been unfinished or Jean was interrupted in the middle of writing it. But photos of the note are easily available for viewing online, and I gotta tell you, it looks to me like the sentence ends in a period, not a comma. The last line, "It will work best this way while mother is away," does make logical sense, since Jean's mother was away in Kentucky at that time, so if Jean needed to take care of something she didn't want her mother to know about, this would have been an ideal time to do it. If the note is significant, I guess it's possible that whoever got rid of the purse did not bother to perform a thorough search of it and had no idea the note was in there, or the note just has no real connection to why she went missing. Incidentally, I do have to mention that I find it amusing that it happens to contain the names of two famous characters from Star Trek, even though it was written nearly 20 years before Star Trek was even a thing. So we have two people who were pushed as potential candidates to be the mysterious Dr. Scott, though neither of them was ever found by investigators. One of them was the Air Corps lieutenant known only as Scotty, whom Jean was allegedly having an affair with while her husband was serving in World War II. The problem is that I'm not sure anyone else from Jean's personal life ever met this guy, and we really only have the word of her former divorce attorney that he even existed. He was supposedly violent and abusive, and threatened to kill Jean if she ended the relationship, which would make him a good suspect, but the affair apparently ended 4 years earlier, and as far as I can tell, Jean did not have any issues with Scotty during that time period. And unless he became a doctor since the last time Jean saw him, I'm not sure why she would be referring to him as Dr. Scott. Without any more concrete information about Scotty, it's tough to know if he might have had any role in Jean's disappearance, but I'm inclined to think not. And of course, there has also been speculation that Dr. Scott might have been a former medical student named Doc, who supposedly hung out at the same night spots as Jean and was rumored to perform illegal abortions. But not only was it never proven that this guy crossed paths with Jean, but police were unable to verify if he even existed, so this theory is based on nothing more than hearsay. However, I can definitely understand why the abortion theory has so much traction in this case. I previously did an episode about the 1965 disappearance of Judith Hyams, who also vanished during the pre-Roe vs. Wade era. The most prominent theory in that case is that she died from complications during an illegal abortion, and everyone involved decided to dispose of her body in order to cover up what they had done, and the same thing very well could have happened to Jean. The wording of the note would definitely lend credence to the idea that Jean was planning to get a secret abortion as her mother was out of town, and an event like that would definitely be a big enough deal to lie about spending the night on a film shoot. But while there was a ton of evidence to support the idea that Judith Himes was pregnant at the time she disappeared, we can't say the same thing about Jean, as we really only have the word of one of her girlfriends that Jean had mentioned she was 3 months pregnant. That doesn't necessarily mean she wasn't pregnant, but overall, the botched abortion theory is mostly based on speculation. Of course, the biggest hole in the theory is that if Jean died and the people responsible disposed of her body, why would they have left behind a note which not only named the possible abortionist, but the father of her unborn child as well? So I guess now would be the appropriate time to discuss the possibility that the mysterious Kirk was none other than Kirk Douglas. Jean's attempt at an acting career was not exactly setting the world on fire, since all she was able to obtain thus far were uncredited bit parts. If you search Jean Spangler's name on YouTube, you'll actually find a clip of a Three Stooges short from 1948 titled Mummy's Dummies, in which you can see Jean standing in the background as a harem girl, but this isn't exactly the type of part which will propel someone on the road to stardom. It's no big secret that the casting couch has always been prominent in Hollywood, particularly during this time period, where a number of women would perform sexual favors for powerful men in hopes of getting their big break. Given that Jean had just appeared in a Kirk Douglas film, and he was known for being a womanizer, it's not unreasonable to assume that they might have had an affair, and she became pregnant with his child. I mean, if Jean had recently acted in, say, a John Wayne film, and her mysterious note was addressed to John, it probably would have been a stretch to assume she was referring to him, but Kirk is not an overly common name. According to Florence Spangler, Jean was picked up at their apartment on 2 separate occasions by someone named Kirk, who waited inside the car both times, so Florence never actually saw him. Since Douglas had become a very recognizable Hollywood star, if this particular Kirk was him, I can see why he would keep a low profile and not show his face if he was carrying on this secret affair. We also have the account from Robert Cummings that Jean told him she was carrying on a casual affair and was, quote-unquote, having the time of her life. It's easy to assume this affair was with Douglas, but if you read some of the earliest newspaper accounts of this case, it looks like the man she may have been referring to was a screenwriter named Peter Brooks. The day after Jean went missing, Brooks kept trying to phone her apartment multiple times and was unable to reach her, so he was actually the one who advised Sophie to go to the police and report her missing. There's very little information out there about Brooks, but apparently he was investigated by police and cleared of any involvement. But even if Jean was carrying on an affair with Brooks, that doesn't necessarily mean she couldn't have been involved with someone else at the same time. Of course, one of the main reasons to be suspicious of Douglas is that he was the one who preemptively contacted the police before they even put 2 and 2 together. He literally phoned up the deputy chief and pretty much said, "Look, I know you guys never asked, but I just wanted to let you know that I'm so not the Kurt in the note written by this missing woman I've totally never met." I mean, it's nice that he wanted to be so cooperative with the police, but this has always come across as being a little too cooperative. Douglas also changed his story, initially claiming that he never met Jean, but then saying that he briefly chatted with her on the set of Young Man with a Horn. I guess it is plausible that he legitimately did not remember her until someone else jogged his memory and reminded him about a girl in a green dress who had been on the set. But if Douglas had something to hide, he could have realized that others might have witnessed their interactions, so he figured it wouldn't be a good idea to pretend he never met her. Now, from most accounts, it sounds like after police interviewed Douglas, they pretty much cleared him as a suspect, But did they do so because there was convincing, clear-cut evidence that he wasn't involved? Or did they just not push him too hard because he was a very powerful, influential star? Douglas's alibi was that he was in Palm Springs at the time Jean went missing, which is over 100 miles outside Los Angeles, so if there was a paper trail or several witnesses who could verify that he was there, then I can see why investigators were inclined to believe that he wasn't involved. But even if he wasn't in LA, that doesn't necessarily mean Douglas had no knowledge of what happened. According to the employee who saw Jean at the farmer's market, she appeared to be waiting for someone, but I have my doubts that a recognizable Hollywood actor is going to meet up with his mistress in a public place. So theoretically, if Jean was planning a secret rendezvous with Douglas that night, he could have sent someone from his entourage to pick her up. One of the potential issues with Douglas's alibi is that even though Jean was last seen in LA, we technically don't know what happened to her after her final phone call with Sophie. Who's to say that she didn't travel to Palm Springs to see Douglas? After all, Jean made a statement to Sophie about having to work the full 8 hours, so if she was planning to take a lengthy trip, she would need a cover story to account for being gone for such a large amount of time. The biggest hole in this theory is that if something happened to Jean in Palm Springs, why would someone travel all the way back to LA to dispose of her purse in Griffith Park? And of course, why leave the note which flat out mentioned Kirk's name inside? So let's suppose that Jean really did become pregnant with Douglas's child and was planning to get an abortion with someone named Dr. Scott. She decided to write a note to Douglas explaining her intentions, but something happened to her before the note could be delivered. Whoever was responsible for Jean's disappearance did not have any connection to the note, which might explain why they didn't bother to get rid of it. In fact, if someone else did kill Jean, they might have considered the note to be a blessing in disguise because they knew the police would put so much focus on it, leading the investigation away from them. Even if Douglas had no direct involvement in Jean's disappearance, he still would have had reason to lie to the police and withhold key information in order to conceal his potentially scandalous affair with her. If this is close to the truth about what actually happened, then the one theory where this explanation would most fit is if Jean was murdered by her ex-husband, Dexter. What if Jean was telling the truth about visiting Dexter that night, but her ulterior motive for speaking with him about an overdue child support payment was to obtain money to pay for an abortion? If Kirk Douglas was the father of her unborn child, Jean may have been hoping that he would pay for it, but he was in Palm Springs at that time, and Jean wanted to get the abortion over with while her mother was out of town. Out of desperation, Jean may have decided that temporarily borrowing money from Dexter was the best option. During the 2.5-hour gap between when Jean left her apartment and made the phone call to Sophie, she may have spent that time attempting to meet up with Kirk and talk to him about this, but once she realized this wasn't going to happen, Jean decided to write him the note. Now, given their hostile relationship, I seriously doubt that Jean would have told Dexter she needed the money for an abortion, and probably would have tried to obtain it through the guise of asking for an increase in child support payments. But this could have led to a heated confrontation which turned violent, and if Dexter ripped Jean's purse from her shoulder, causing one of the straps to break, he could have looked inside and seen the note to Kirk. When you consider that Dexter lost a heated legal battle over custody of their daughter, finding out that Jean had become pregnant with another child and was planning to abort it may have driven him over the edge and prompted him to kill her. After disposing of Jean's body, Dexter then dumped her purse in Griffith Park, possibly hoping that the discovery of the note would lead investigators in the wrong direction, and he also got his wife to provide him with an alibi and tell police they never saw Jean that night. Honestly, out of all the potential theories, I think this one does make the most sense and accounts for some of the weirder elements of this case, but it is mostly based on pure speculation. The only incriminating evidence against Dexter is that he allegedly had scratches on his face following Jean's disappearance, which certainly sounds suspicious, but the only source for this piece of information is Sophie, who supposedly heard it secondhand from the police. I'm not trying to say that Sophie was lying, but investigators never expressed any public suspicion towards Dexter or confirmed the detail about the scratches, and without that, there's really nothing to implicate him. I mean, Dexter did fight tooth and nail with Florence over custody of Christine, and he even fled to Florida to avoid going to jail on a contempt of court charge, but that only proves he's a jerk, not a murderer. If this theory is true, then it would be a pretty incredible coincidence if Jean was carrying on an affair with a big-name Hollywood star and planning to abort his unborn child, yet the real killer turned out to be her ex-husband. But anything is possible. And I guess I should also make it clear that we still cannot be 100% certain that Jean was involved with Kirk Douglas and became pregnant with him, so for all we know, the man she was referring to in her note might have been an entirely different man named Kirk. But given that Douglas allegedly has some major skeletons in his closet, I can see why it would be tempting to believe he was involved in this story somehow. Since Dexter and his wife Lynn have since passed away, Douglas may have been the last surviving person who had any information about what happened to Jean, but if he knew any secrets, he took them to his grave. Overall, this is such a crazy case with so many potential theories that I really could not say with 100% certainty what happened to her. Unfortunately, the one thing I am pretty certain about is that Jean did not take off voluntarily and most likely died on the same night she went missing. I know that 70 years have passed, but the LAPD still considers this to be an open and active case, so if by chance you happen to have any information on the disappearance of Jean Spangler, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, I decided to do a more lighthearted episode about my top 10 unsolved mysteries guilty pleasures, where I discuss some of the sillier segments the show ever produced, which still somehow managed to be very entertaining. And for our patrons in tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Andy W., Jennifer M., Karen K., Josh S., Teresia S., Mike L., and Heather S. Thank you all so much for your support. And before we bring this episode about an infamous missing persons case to a close, I'd like to play a promo for another true crime podcast titled, appropriately enough, Missing Persons. Have a listen.
It's estimated that at any given time, there are 90,000 missing persons, and that's just in the United States. Imagine if your loved one went missing. Is there anything that you wouldn't do to try and find them? Would you cross oceans? Spend your life savings? Continually retrace your last known steps, just hoping something jumped out at you? This is Missing Persons, a brand new podcast, and I'm your host, Mike Morford. If you're a true crime podcast fan, you might recognize me from some of my other podcasts, including Criminology, 3 Men and a Mystery, and The Murder of My Family. The most important part of hosting a podcast for me is advocating for the cases and the victims I discuss, as well as their families. I've been approached by so many people with a missing loved one asking me if I could help them in any way. And if it was my loved one that was missing, I'd want someone to help me too, so I couldn't say no. And this podcast, Missing Persons, is the result of me wanting to help. In every episode of Missing Persons, you'll hear about a person who disappeared and currently remains missing. In some cases, there are clues to follow and leads to check on. In other cases, it's as if the person just vanished off the face of the earth. And in each episode, you'll hear from someone who's searching for that missing person, and whether they've been looking for 30 days or 30 years, the pain of not knowing what happened to their loved one is real. And the search for answers, a painful one. Missing Persons officially launches in March 2020. Will you join me and become part of the search for answers in these cases? If so, search for and subscribe to Missing Persons right now, wherever you listen to podcasts, so you don't miss an episode.
I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. Oh, and I suppose this would be an appropriate time to seg into a very important announcement. As you might know, on the weekend of May the 1st to the 3rd, I will be appearing on Podcast Row at CrimeCon, being held at the World Center Marriott Hotel in Orlando. This will mark my 4th consecutive year attending the event, but for the first time, McGill and Vince Nitro will be joining me there. So if you attend, not only will you get to meet me, you'll get the opportunity to meet all three of us. So if you would like to purchase tickets and haven't already done so, you can get a 10% discount by visiting crimecon.com and using the promo code COLD20. That's COLD20. Anyway, if you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.